It was a very, very interesting and contentious period.
The growing edge of art and sculpture was complete abstraction.
There's no such thing as inspiration for me.
A work is completely finished, or it's not finished at all.
We dream great dreams, and our hands can't execute them always.
It was a very, very interesting and contentious period.
America in mid-30s was really beset by depression.
In the 30s, nobody sold anything, you know, and there were no one-man shows. We used to sit in cafeterias in New York and talk about art.
Stuart Davis, who had the recognition and the position of being a leading artist, could not support himself by his art.
I had this cold water flat that cost $10 a month at that time, and I was thrown out after a few months because I couldn't pay the rent.
I felt myself being very sympathetic to the plight of people who were suffering, and I could see that around me.
So when you had that engraved upon your consciousness, you couldn't entirely be a jolly, unconcerned person. So that was on the backs of all of us. I was right there waiting in line for the project to start. And not only that, but all my friends were right there with me.
In order to get on WPA, you had to first get on what we called welfare.
It was a process that hurt your dignity, because you had to be penniless.
You had to invent a story that coincided with the requirements of getting on welfare in New York and so on. We had to kill off our parents. We had to have graduated from schools that had burnt down, and therefore all records were non-existent.
You had to go through that process along with thousands of other people and hundreds of artists. And then I was put on the mural project on WPA. So I was a wage earner.
In order to keep the art project going, we understood that we had to do a little picketing once in a while, because there were those in Congress who were against the art projects. They thought it was a waste of money.
The Congress at that time was very, very conservative and very anti-New Deal, and therefore anti-WPA art projects.
The amazing thing about it is the abstract painters and sculptors were allowed to do their kind of work.
The founding of the American Abstract Artists started very spontaneously.
We all got together at Holtzman's studio, and we began talking about the necessity of abstract art, and then gradually we decided that we ought to have an exhibition.
It took a few months, but we had our first exhibit at the Squibb Gallery on 57th and 5th.
Everybody, even in the poorest times, would scrape up the $5, $10 dues to show his or her painting in the group shows.
This group tended to feel a special mission, even beyond what most artists would feel.
Since we felt as a minority, and a kind of an oppressed or neglected minority in terms of our artistic expression, we banded together, really.
They had a cause. We had a cause. The cause was a blank out there, and we wanted to fill it in.
We were very much criticized in the press. The press generally regarded us as boondogglers and useless people.
And of course, the ones that they made most mockery of were the artists.
The American Abstract Artists exhibitions were reviewed, but I think mostly in a desultory way.
There were snide remarks about people doing something that they didn't know that a monkey with his tail could do, or a donkey with his tail could do.
Most of them dismissed the work as imitative of Europe or as decorative.
Social realism so predominated the cultural values in the late 1930s that to a great extent American abstract art was considered to be a kind of ivory towerism.
Our recognition as being useful citizens came much, much, much later.
In the late 30s, when the rise of German fascism was so threatening, the only real force countering Nazis was that of the Soviet Union. So in New York politics, it wasn't a question at all of being a Democrat or a Republican. It was rather you were a communist or a Trotskyite.
And I had very, very serious and often bitter exchanges with people on the left on this whole question of aesthetics.
The communists were very, very anti-modern art, and particularly so in relation to abstract art.
They favored what they call social conscious art, like paintings showing policemen beating up strikers and things like that. And I was interested in doing abstract sculpture, so that was very unpopular with them.
Divisions occurred among people. Friendships broke up. Marriages broke up.
The WPA began to come apart in 1942 when the war was underway and the government was no longer interested in putting any money into such things as culture.
I was married at the time and I had a child, so I was not among the first to be drafted. But I wanted to be useful in some ways, so I went to work in the shipyards.
I went to work in a factory. So from 1941 until 1946, there was no art whatsoever that I can remember.
Most of my friends like de Kooning and others were overaged and they weren't drafted, but I was, and I wasn't against it. I thought it was a just war, and so I did the best I could.
World War II had a tremendous impact on everything.
We're really trying all our lives to do one work. Young people like myself at that time in the academies were beginning to look around and notice the work of other contemporary artists such as Picasso and Matisse and Braque. We didn't understand what they were doing, why they did it, and so on. All we knew about their work was that it was fascinating, that it somehow seemed profoundly right without our knowing why. And that was the challenge. I began to ask them questions about the moderns, and they said, "Emmanuel, stay clear of them. They're poison. They will ruin you." I had no idea what direction I would take, except I knew that I could not go back to the academy, that I had to find a new language with which to work. I gave up carving in stone because the city of New York condemned the building in which I lived. And I had time only to do one horse's head and part of a figure, a 6-foot figure of a man with a pneumatic jackhammer. And then I had to move. And I couldn't take anything. I took the horse's head and I left all the stone, several tons of stone in that studio, and I moved across Manhattan into a loft on the 4th floor without an elevator. And at that point I realized I couldn't continue as a carver. And so I started to work in clay. And I've been happy ever since. There are such great standing figures that I've seen that I measure myself against and find myself wanting, you know. Though some of these things are not too bad. I look back and sometimes I say, Jesus, did I make that? It looks pretty good, you know. That's in a moment of weakness, mind you. And somehow, no figure that I've ever done yet has said what I would like ultimately to say. And so I keep searching. And I will go on making these standing figures, hoping that somehow one of them will emerge, that I will feel that it has, in fact, said the standing figure. You see, basically, we're really trying all our lives to do one work. And everything we do is really an attempt to do that one work, which sums up somehow everything we feel. But it takes a lifetime of work and a warehouse full of sculpture, it seems, to do that one work. Let us say I have an idea of a reclining figure in mind. The last thing I want to do is go directly towards making it a reclining figure. I want to keep my solutions open so that if it's going to be a reclining figure, it's got to fight very hard for its existence. I may even at a certain point introduce the image of a horse just to throw myself off. I've got to, in the course of this struggle, allow what's within me on the deepest level to emerge. The struggle will make the final image far more intriguing, far more personal, far more mysteriously arrived at. We hope someday we can look upon something we've done and say, not too bad, huh?
I admire any kind of achievement. I discovered modern art from a mysterious inner wave, I think. There wasn't much that I could see because I was in upstate New York in an environment that was provincial, essentially. As a spoiled and brilliant student there, I asked my parents if they would stake me to further education in Paris. My reaction to what I saw of modernism in Paris was one of great joy and liberation. I welcomed it, I understood it. I had no difficult adjustment. I think I was a born modernist. Enough people have consistently told me, so that I feel that it's real, that they see a lot of funny things in my work. I don't set out to do it as funny. I think that if I do have humor, it's to myself. I do see a lot of funny things. And I think life is very funny, and it's crazy funny, life is. So I suppose that element creeps in to my work. It must, because people have told me about it. This was a very direct connection between working on the canvas and seeing life. As I planned it and drew it, I gave myself the liberty in this quiet place by myself of making whoops and hollers of excitement. So you can say that that's an outward manifestation of some of the tense venting that goes on. I'm no expert on the creative process. I am a participant. To me, it's excitement. It's gratification. There are letdowns. We dream great dreams, and our hands can't execute them always. I accept it as part of life, and I accept it as part of the process of creativity. But for those who are willing to give a look and to open their eyes and minds and hearts to art, and mine in particular, I hope to give them a thrill. I hope to give them joy, a sense of order. It's really what any artist, I think, hopes for in his art.
I don't consider it finished until I'm satisfied with it. Well, in kindergarten, I used to like to model in clay, and the teacher used to hold my work up to the other kids to show them, so I early got the idea that it was something I was good at. I made a little dinosaur, and at that time, I must have been about 8 or 9 or so, and the mouth was open and it had teeth, and I took a little piece of red paper and put it inside for a tongue. I'm not sure that dinosaurs have tongues, but anyway. And so I was on my way walking in the street to show this dinosaur to some friends, and 2 little girls walked by and they looked at it and they screamed in terror and ran away. So I was convinced that art was a very powerful thing. Many people think that abstract artists have abandoned nature. Now, I maintain that there's no possibility of ever abandoning nature, because who is speaking? Every atom that makes me up is nature. Every erg of energy in my brain and all the processes within my body, including my thinking, is nature. And everything I look at is nature, and I don't believe that anything can exist that is not nature in the whole universe. I had to experiment. Of course, my goal was to be able to make open structures in 3 dimensions. And first I worked with plaster over wire and pipe, because for one thing, that was all I could afford. I even tried using liquid rubber that would harden, I thought if I made things in that, it would at least not crack. The trouble with that is it smelled for years afterwards. It just had that rubber smell. And anyway, I didn't find it very conducive to work with. While I'm working on a sculpture, I do not think of ideas that are outside of the work. I pay attention to what's going on in front of my eyes. I often have music playing, but I concentrate on the actual shapes and colors that are happening. It's a complete concentration. As I'm working, I begin to see the possibilities, and one shape gives me an idea for something else, and I just work through instinct and make the shapes that look right, forms that appear to work. a work of art must work. See?
In art, a work is completely finished or it's not finished at all. When I began working with Hans Hofmann in the fall of 1932, the most important contribution was a basic working understanding about modern art. That abstraction had a natural basis and not a novel one. And then in particular, he gave me the entirely new concept of space, which has stayed with me ever since. Normally, we think of space as being a negative element. It's in between things. But from Hofmann, I saw that space had its own character, its own life. It took on a substantial beingness, and that has stayed with me ever since. Living in New York is certainly an experience of absurdity. I mean, the whole city is absurd, and so forth and so forth. The culture is absurd. Yuppieism is absurd. So it's somewhat satisfying for me to think that as part of an absurd culture, I can express that, and then somebody else can see the absurdity in the work. I didn't plan it that way, but it makes me a little bit comfortable when I see certain ridiculous situations in our culture and think that to a certain extent my work is part of the time. What you start with is a kind of initial stimulus, but then the whole point is it has to be realized. It has to be worked into form. Beginning in 1979 approximately, I began to work with birds. And almost at the same time, I got into pop subject matter. That led to discos. And then now, for the past 3 years, I am into a city series. So I don't have any fixed idea of what would be an ideal painting, but I rather see it as something dimly prefigured. I begin my paintings improvisationally, mostly. And that's all freewheeling. All the way, it's chance and accent. But then at a certain point, an image emerges. And at that point, the form bugaboo gets on my back. So I keep torturing it until I get it somehow not to be a disaster. I work in terms of what I think is right. And then I hope that there will be some kind of reception to this outside. I had a very bad year this past year when I only finished one painting, which is over here, and where this painting is about 3/4 finished. But as you know, in art, a work is completely finished or it's not finished at all.
such thing as inspiration for me. Ilya was a very unusual person. He was a walking encyclopedia. We got married in 1933 after he bugged me for about 2-3 years to get married. In the meetings of all kinds of societies and whatever we belonged at that time to, the conversation about art was way above my understanding. But I didn't let on. I just sat around and looked pretty, and in the meantime, I was collecting knowledge. One day, Ilya came in and said that a group of painters was going to organize an abstract artist group. He came in and he says, I want you to belong to it. I said, how can I belong to it? I don't paint abstract. Not really. He says, well, if you want to, you can. I said, all right. So I produced my first abstract picture under pressure. Dressmaking, in the way it was practiced in Slobodkina family, was never just a trade. It was always an art. Dressmaking and dress designing all gave me training in composition and in balance, in color, in general appearance of things. To this day, I don't believe in ugly pictures. To me, a thing has to be beautiful. Of course, I always joke that the two people looking at a painting are saying it can't be art, it's too beautiful. Well, nothing is too beautiful for me. I don't stand in awe of what will my inspiration produce for me. There's no such thing as inspiration for me. There's work, attention, and taste. Inspiration is nothing but concentration, interest in your work, and dedication. I do believe in dedication, but I don't wait for inspiration. I wait for time and opportunity to work. That's all that's necessary. And of course, a little talent doesn't hurt. In my case, transition from so-called realistic painting to abstract wasn't so drastic because, in a way, I've always kept the same attitude towards whatever it is I'm doing, whether I'm making a still life, painting a landscape, or making a completely abstract composition. I still have the same elements in mind that are of importance. It should be well balanced, the shapes should be interesting, the colors should be attractive, because to me it isn't that divided. The elements of good painting or good sculpturing are everywhere.
The American abstract artists were affordable. They were a group of artists who had really not been collected at that point. And I think after we got to know some of the artists, we were convinced that this was the period we wanted to collect.
We would just hope that the people can get a sense of what the artists went through at the time and what they wound up producing because of the forces that were being brought to bear. The social forces, the poverty of the Depression period, the support by the WPA, and the prejudice against them by the museum establishment.
We're so happy that they're on exhibition and will be permanently in a public museum, the National Museum of American Art. It's given us a lot of pleasure.